Hi there. Welcome to Community Policy Speaks, our podcast here at the Community Policy Forum. The Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities facing British Muslim communities. We attempt this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. Today's discussion will center on the recently released Bloom Review, and we're very, very fortunate to be joined by two esteemed guests that are undoubtedly experts in this area and will have many valuable insights to share with us. Firstly, we're joined by Yahya Burt, a community historian who has taught at the University of Leeds. He has an MPhil in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Oxford. He has published over a dozen peer-reviewed articles on Islam in Britain. His co-authored books include British Secularism and Religion, Islam in Victorian Liverpool, the collected poems of Abdullah Quilliam, and Our Fatima of Liverpool. In 2022, he published his first poetry collection, Pandemic Pilgrimage. He's a founding co-editor of the Oxford British Muslim Studies series at the Oxford University Press. He works as a research director at the Ayan Institute in London, where he focuses on Muslim minorities. His first report for them was Ummah at the Margins, the Past, Present and Future of Muslim Minorities, which was published last year. Currently, Yahya is working on a report on global Hindutva. He lives in West Yorkshire with his family and cats. He likes walking and being grumpy about the state of the world, as I'm sure we all do at the moment. And he can be reached on Twitter at @yburt. We're also joined today by John Holmwood. John is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Nottingham. He was expert witness for the defence in professional misconduct cases brought against teachers accused of, quote unquote, Islamifying the curriculum in the Birmingham schools. Together with Teresa O'Toole, he is author of Countering Extremism in Birmingham Schools, The Truth About the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair, and also with Gurminder K. Pamra of Colonialism and Modern Social Theory. And also with Dr. Leila Aitel-Hajj. John is co-director of the People's Review of Prevent. Thank you so much, Yahya and John, for joining us today to discuss the Bloom Review. So firstly, starting with yourself, Yahya, for our listeners that perhaps are not so familiar with this review, could you please tell us a little bit more about the origins of the review?
Well, thanks very much for having me. And it's an honor to be sharing a podcast with John, whose work I admire very much. The Bloom Review was commissioned in 2019. Colin Bloom, somebody from an evangelical background, ostensibly an independent advisor to the then Department for Communities and Local Government. Now it's called Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Very much the report that in broad terms, the report was going to ask the question of how government should relate to all faith communities in Britain, rather than how all faith communities should relate to government. So it's very much a top-down exercise. What can government do for you, so to speak? And it was very much delayed by COVID. And COVID, in fact, I think shapes a lot of the thinking around the early part of the report. Additionally, they said that they received over 22,000 responses and had to deal with 1 million pieces of information. I mean, I'm very kind of skeptical about how anyone could really metabolize such a huge volume of education. And certainly the report doesn't feel like an exercise in metabolizing a huge amount of information. It's written in very, very broad brushstrokes and seems to, in a way, cleave to the line of government policy rather than show an independent spirit of empirical inquiry, summarizing the kind of complexity that you would have with that level of public engagement. It doesn't feel like it's engaged with 22,000 responses. Let me put it that way. It feels highly processed, the final report, and so was very disappointing from that point of view. And so I think it's quite rare to have a report with this broad kind of remit. And yet with that wide remit, the result is disappointingly narrow, really. And the thing that surprised me the most was how little, relatively little, that was positive in the report about the state as an enabler of faith, the liberal state, where basically you leave people to pursue their version of the good life in their religious associational life, in their philanthropy, and so on. There's really not too much about that. There is something about faith communities helping a cash-strapped state to deal with a crisis like the COVID pandemic, but there's very little of a sort of broader liberal view, if you like, of the state as an enabling civil society to flourish. One could even say there was a sort of a classic conservatism where, Burkean platoons, people would get together and they would, fashion their version of the good with minimal state interference. There's none of that either. What instead we really have is a very idea of a more centralized state that is intervening really to mitigate, to protect the public and religious believers from the harms of their own faith community. So there's a series of different sectors which we'll go in to talk about, but really it seems very much in a kind of increasingly post-Christian Britain that religion is seen, public religion and public life in civic space is seen as a harmful substance, which has to be, controlled really by the state, which is determining risk and harm vis-a-vis these sorts of religious collectivities. And I think it's actually underneath all of it a quite antagonistic report in that sense. Religion as a bearer of risk and harm and potential danger. And so although the report calls for religious literacy, at a fundamental level, I feel that it's actually religiously illiterate in that sense. It can't justify religion as a public good. It can only be seen as a public harm, in essence, unless it fulfills centralizing state objectives, really. Unless it fulfills the centralizing objectives of the state, it's potentially harmful and unregulated.
Thank you so much, Yahya, for that. I think obviously you've sort of provided a useful insight vis-a-vis the review's overarching presentation of faith and religion. Could you please speak a little bit more to the sort of reports or the review's presentation of Islam specifically?
Well, I think that Islam and Colin Bloom has been explicit about this in interviews that he has given since the release of the review, that on the scale of extremism, Muslim community and Islamic extremism is clearly the highest threat, according to him. And this is part of his sort of reasoning in terms of providing a sliding scale of harms, which seem to mirror those given, promoted by the Home Office and other departments of state. And there's no consideration whatsoever of the harm of securitization to a whole community. Seeing a whole community of British citizens, of formerly and British citizens, as full citizens of the state, engaging with the state at all levels, and in civil society at all levels, at least in theory, as well as in practice. Instead, they're seen as risky citizens whose harms have to be mitigated by the state, and that is the framing that the report does not even even question at all, which I think betrays its sort of government-centric perspective.
Yeah, can I
Thank you.
That because
Please,
I think
go ahead.
Because I think it's very extraordinary that it has a chapter on extremism, religion, faith-based extremism, and doesn't discuss prevent and the prevent policy at all. It's obviously aligned with the prevent policy, but gives no mention to it. And so the harms done to religious expression, are completely missing, or the main cause of the harms done to religious expression are completely missing. And yet the report has at different places reference to the fact that there is a squeezing out of religious voices in the public sphere, and you say, well, yes, because that's part of the consequence of government policy, especially with regard to minority religion. So I think that aspect of it is extraordinary. And of course, if you're talking about the positive aspects of religion, or if you wish to promote the positive aspects of religion, you need to say a lot more about them, and also recognize the context in which many people are going to read this report. They're going to read it in the context of the Shawcross report just having come out, emphasizing a focus away from right-wing extremism and a greater emphasis on so-called Islamist extremists. And so people are going to be very worried where they see your emphasis upon regulation against harms. They say, well, yes, it's going to be the usual suspects. And Bloom does nothing to avoid that, nothing to give the sense of what one had hoped the experience of COVID would be, is a really strong endorsement of how different faith-based groups actually acted in order to to provide support within local communities. I don't mean simply ways of carrying on with their religious activities, but also extending that to ensuring that people were fed, supported, and so on. So that should have been very strongly part of the report, I think, and I think would have gone some way to allaying fears that people have otherwise with the government. And I have to say, I agree very strongly with the ad. There's something peculiar about a government who is in the area of markets, it's about deregulation. In the area of professional activities, it's about self-regulation. And in the area of religion, which is, after all, one of the key areas of personal responsibility and freedom, it's all about central authoritarian government control. And that's really quite, really very concerning indeed, I think.
Thank you, John. I think that leads nicely on to kind of my next question, which was around religious education in general, and particularly sort of faith-based schools and regulation of faith-based schools. Could you please sort of summarize Bloom's key conclusions around these areas, and also just talk to us a little bit more about what you make of them?
Well, I think it has this unfortunate sense that what he's encouraging is religious literacy, and which is, I'm a secular person, so I understand what it is to talk in terms of learning about religion. But you would expect somebody who actually believed in religion and the value of religion would have something to say about learning from religion. And I think religious education should surely have an educative content from religion itself. How religion facilitates children developing character, their sense of themselves, their place in the world, and so on. These are really important aspects of education. And yet he turns it almost into an instrumental thing of being literate and having literacy about others, rather than, in a sense, learning about what motivates others, what they think of important things in life, and being able as a child and young person to understand that kind of that as one of the key aspects of the of religious education in the curriculum. And after all, England is unusual in having compulsory religious education in non-religious schools, that is in non-faith designated schools, and compulsory collective worship. So some people don't like that. British humanists don't like it. The secular society doesn't like it. And they don't like this report. But the report doesn't say anything about it, what its value is, and why it's still, why it remains important. And it talks about the decline of religious education, but really the decline of religious education is surprising in the context of it being compulsory. That is, that it should have a robust presence within schools. So if schools are reporting, or if people are reporting out of that, those thousands of responses, that there is less religious education, then some places are not following what the legal requirement on religious education is. And there used to be a system in Britain, a very effective system, where local communities were responsible for religious education determined by local needs, and the curriculum determined in terms of discussions across different faith groups and with teachers and with local politicians to deliver what was called a locally agreed curriculum. It was the Conservative Party that decided, or the Conservative government that decided, the local agreed curriculum was not to be required on academy schools. There's a couple of sentences in the report which refers to the decline of religious education associated with the academies program, but there's absolutely no explanation of why there would be that decline and how it has undermined local communities. If you think that one of the reasons why the report and the report about faith is important, because faith is the most local of activities in terms of, as Bloom himself says, it's religion convenes activity at local levels through churches, mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras, and so on, and spreads out from those local activities in terms of charitable and other kinds of engagement. So if what you have done is actually steadily over the last 10 or 15 years undermine the basis of different religious groups coming together, finding a place where they discuss things locally, and then you say what we need is to encourage interfaith activity, and what we need is to have better religious literacy, you ought really to be pointing your finger at the very ways in which you have undermined that in order to bring into being a highly centralized education system where 75% of secondary schools are directed under the authority of the Secretary of State in London and Westminster, rather than under the responsibility of local authorities. So I do think that there's a disjuncture in that area, and one which has has actually, I think, undermined religious interactions locally. It's not, it's as if Bloom thinks that religious organizations, religious groups are representatives of themselves and not actually engaged with others and have an extensive dialogue across them, but those opportunities of dialogue are, have been removed.
Thank you, John. And just staying with yourself and sort of on that discussion around faith-based schools, obviously a lot of Muslim families will grow up sending, or their children will grow up being sent to madrasas, for example, often on the weekends. What does Bloom say about faith-based schools, particularly madrasas, and how does this fit within the review?
Well, the concern he's expressing is one that goes back and has been expressed since 2011 and the Prevent strategy set out in 2011, that schools which are outside Ofsted regulation are potentially problematic. I don't think there's much evidence for that claim. There wasn't in 2011, but as Prevent has fanned the flames of concerns around this area, then obviously if you're bringing in lots of regulation for regular schools, for publicly funded schools, independent schools and so on, and you're pushing Ofsted in that direction. And I'll just make a sideways look, the very concern that everybody has with Ofsted reports and schools being deemed inadequate goes back to this kind of concern that a safeguarding issue can be sufficient to have a school defined as inadequate. And in many cases, that safeguarding issue is associated with Prevent. It was in the Birmingham Trojan Horse schools, which were all outstanding schools defined as inadequate because somehow they failed in the area of Prevent. So you've got this, so obviously you're now going to say, well, where are children gathered, where they are currently not being supervised? But by not being supervised, I mean is not being supervised by a government warranted official process. And that's an extraordinary thing. So they're talking about Sunday schools after church. They're talking about madrasas. They're talking about yeshivas. But what they are missing is the extent to which they're creating some of these problems themselves. So after the Birmingham Trojan Horse affair and the attack upon Islamic ethos within schools, a lot of parents withdrew their children into homeschooling precisely because they couldn't get a sympathetic religious experience for their children within regular schools. That was all supervised, properly regulated, and so on. And so what they represent is a situation that they think a lot of parents are using, piecing together a homeschool package out of bits and pieces of separately provided provision, whether that is by madrasas or yeshivas or otherwise. So I think this is a panic largely of their own making. I happen to be of the view that it would be a good thing if there was a proper knowledge of whether children were in school or not, what kind of provision they were having or not. But the scandal is that the government hasn't done that as a matter of a general interest in safeguarding, but is wishing to do it in terms of a particular focus upon what they perceive as a problem of religious education. It's no less a problem potentially for the children coming under, who are supported by Mumsnet, if we put it in those terms. If it's a problem of, are we confident that we understand that a child may or may not be at risk? And if you look at the report carefully, what you will see is an awful lot of the concerns that are being pushed into the space of religion are ones that more properly belong as general concerns and are about a failure of safeguarding, by which I don't mean prevent, but a failure to properly support local authorities, properly support social workers and so on, to be able to intervene to protect children who have a right to be protected, rather than to have a presumption that any child in this particular space is at risk. One should say, let's make sure we're protecting all children from the risks of poverty, abuse, and so on. And if you look carefully in the report, you can see that some of his concerns come out of other reports about child sexual abuse, and now he's given it a religious twist, and giving it a religious twist does what Yahya said was pathologize religion, as if there was something as if religious people were problematic rather than, sadly, some of all kinds of people problematic.
I think that there is, I hope I'm not misreading the Bloom review, but it seems that it is backing the Shawcross argument that safeguarding is no longer should be central to counter-extremism policy. Nonetheless, the last time there's an attempt to regulate out-of-school settings in 2015, it was quashed by the objections of British Christians. They didn't want too much interference in Sunday schools and so on and so forth. It seems that Bloom is another attempt to do this, but with Christians, hopefully bringing Christians on board by saying there are safeguarding issues that are specific to madrasas and yeshivas. And that the state has to intervene. This is not the case with scout groups or Sunday schools and other such out-of-hours education settings where there are children. So I think that is, it seems to me that's one issue. It seems to me to be discriminatory. The second thing I would say is that there's always been, with the history of Prevent and so on in counterterrorism policy in general, there's always been a just understandable fear amongst Britain's Muslim communities that that whether it's counter-extremism policy or whether now safeguarding, this is a way, in a way of looking to undermine the independence of madrasas. And to look to kind of influence the curriculum offered in madrasas. In other words, to make them sort of state compliant and fit for more sort of centralized purpose, if you like. In fact, it's their independence that renders them suspect in some way. So I think that, the fear has always been that an issue, whether it's counter-extremism and now safeguarding has been detached from that safeguarding, will be used as a point of leverage to influence the content of what is taught in madrasas. And I think that remains a live concern.
Yeah, can I sort of come in behind that? Because I think I really strongly agree with that. That if you say the issue, the way of dealing with that, say, well, how do we deal with the issue of hours, is through regulating homeschooling and through having some kind of register around children who are homeschooled and so on. And there's a faint emphasis upon that. That wouldn't address the issue of madrasas, because that wouldn't be focused upon at madrasas, because what you would be focused on is the child and having properly registered the nature of the provision that the child is getting and how that is met. So you would be pushing the responsibility for declaring the nature of the homeschooling upon the parent or guardian who is undertaking that activity, by saying that it will be the issue of the space in which a child receives some education, and particularly where that education is specifically of a religious kind. Bear in mind that Bloom is saying, well, religious literacy, I mean, that's not religious education as such, as would be understood by instruction within the faith and inculcation into different practices and so on, which is what happens whether it's Sunday school, yeshiva or madrasa. By saying the content should be open to scrutiny, that does, when the content is specifically a religion, it says what the religious community embodies and expresses. That is a really dangerous development. And imagine, why would Ofsted be responsible for how Islam is taught within a madrasa, or how the Talmud is expressed within a yeshiva? It is extraordinary, really. But there is a way through it. But obviously, and the way through it is, it's about homeschooling, and it's about making sure that the child who is being homeschooled, and in principle then without much public scrutiny of other adults, whether they be, fellow religionists or whatever, that child is properly safeguarded. By properly safeguarded, I mean in the sense of with a focus upon their welfare, not a focus on public safety.
Thank you both. I think just sort of slightly shifting the discussion a little bit and coming back to yourself, Yahya. We spoke a little bit earlier about, the presentation of Islamist extremism and faith-based extremism generally within the report. Obviously yourself, Yahya, you're currently working on a report on global Hindutva. So I wanted to ask you to please speak more to discussions of other forms of faith-based extremism and nationalism within the review. What sorts of forms of these phenomena are brought up within the review, and what kind of presentation does Bloom provide of these various types?
Well, I mean, Bloom, it's important to, I think, as we've said earlier, to compare Bloom in the context of the Shawcross Review. Unlike the Shawcross Review, Bloom doesn't say that the focus on right-wing extremism has detracted from attention on Islamism. Rather, what Bloom is saying, it seems to be saying, is that it's detracted attention from new forms of religious extremism that have escaped the notice of government. It's interesting. He spends about 2 paragraphs talking about Hindu extremism, 1 paragraph talking about Buddhist extremism, and 12 pages talking about Sikh extremism, in particular the call for an independent state in the Punjab called Khalistan. And this dates back to the 80s, and when the storming of the Golden Temple in Amritsar inaugurated a kind of call for a more independent Sikh entity in India after that happened. And there have always been elements of that call in Britain, in the Sikh diaspora. I think that what I found extraordinary about this weighting in the report is that it almost completely ignores what happened in Leicester last year. I won't say too much about that because we're focusing on the Bloom report, but it doesn't really deal with the emergence of Hindu nationalism as a global force in the world. India is now the world's 5th largest economy. It has the world's largest population. It has a huge middle class. And under the BJP nationalist government, which has been in power since 2014 and won a resounding victory in 2019, it's clear to most dispassionate observers that minorities in the country are in grave threat. Muslims, Christians, and Dalits, the untouchable caste in India, and any other critics, secular people on the left in India and others are under serious threat from a sort of authoritarian, intolerant, majoritarian government. Now, the point is that since 2014, the government has adopted a policy akin to the state of Israel vis-a-vis the Jewish diaspora. So in other words, Israel being the champion of Jewish minorities everywhere, aggressively championed their interests in the world, political, economic, and so on, as well as them being expected to support Israel and its interests, a sort of reciprocal relationship. And this is the model that's been taken up by the BJP government. And this has had a big impact on the political makeup of Hindu diasporic groups. The important places are the Middle East, America, and Britain. These are the most important centers for the Hindu diaspora. And there's been a lot of evidence of a kind of a real clean sweep of Hindu communal organizations by BJP supporting elements within these communities. And so the focus has been looking at it as a local problem of public unrest, okay, where the police allowed antisocial behavior to spin out of control and allowed confrontation between different groups of youths from different communities. That was how it's been projected. That's how they want. But actually, the more worrying thing about all of it is the political blowback of the whole thing. And so it's things like the response of the business and political classes within the Hindu community in Leicester, the absolute defense of the contact of the Hindu youth, no self-criticism whatsoever, the support of right-wing think tanks, the attack on Muslim youth, the ignoring of mass trolling from India, the silencing of critics of Hindu nationalism, and so on. So there's a whole coordinated political script which is familiar, which is being played out in Britain, from last year onwards, which is very familiar to anybody who pays any attention to how Hindu nationalism works within India itself. Mm-hmm. And so the report has nothing to say about any of this. Instead, it spends 12 pages talking about Sikh nationalism. And to be totally frank and honest with you, this is also a target for Hindu nationalists. The Sikh community has been very vociferous about the rise of the reach of global Hindutva in Britain and other places. I've been outspoken critics of what happened in Leicester. So from the Muslim community perspective, it seems like this seems very convenient a very convenient sort of emphasis, politically speaking. So, and I've yet to really see any senior members of the Tory Conservative government step out of line from a kind of fairly strong developing political alliance with India. Britain has just struck a huge trade deal with India, and I think that's highly pertinent to all of this. All the evidence is that if you even voice mild criticisms of the Modi government, they'll be quite quick to threaten you. And so no matter who you are, even if you're the BBC. So I think that this new sort of aggressive stance has made people much more wary, and they're walking on eggshells. And the report is no exception in this.
Yeah, because it's very peculiar that the last year or so saw globally the largest political social movement, that of Punjabi farmers, mainly Sikhs, protesting about government policy in relation to neoliberal programs in relation to food production and so on. So an environmental issue, an issue of subsistence and livelihood, has motivated Sikhs in India. So the presentation of Sikh issues through Khalistan is, I think, a misrepresent, and it's significant that has to go to sources in Canada, which is historically where the diasporic Khalistan movement was. But also, if you say that where the Bloom begins, which he begins with the Equalities Act, and he begins with the Equalities Act talking about religion as a protected characteristic and it being important that religious voices be able to be heard, then the striking thing is, under the Equalities Act, there has been a discussion about, because I'm relating this to the point that was made about caste, opposition to caste, and to the suppression of Dalits, that caste was under consideration as a protected characteristic. The government was supposed to consider it from 2018 onwards, and it looks as if they're going to not proceed in relation to caste as a protected characteristic. Now, I think it's clear why they're not. And Yahya mentioned the trade deal, but of course it's very difficult in a report on religion and harms of religion. I mean, the Henry Jackson Society has now suggested that it's Hindu-phobic to associate caste and Hinduism. It's sort of kind of difficult to know where it's located as a principle, except through Hindu texts. I would be happy to see, for arguments to be made that caste is unnecessary to the expression of Hindu belief. But now you have Henry Jackson saying Hinduphobia is a problem, but they won't recognize Islamophobia. It's so, the hypocrisies are just amazing.
It's all politics, isn't it, in political alliance building? Yeah.
I mean, one of the dangers is, of course, one sees it in, obviously Sikhs are, very angry about what has been said within this report, but one shouldn't be saying, well, let's have prevent directed at Hindus, let's have prevent directed at Sikhs, let's think of everybody that prevent can be directed at. Prevent is a problem, full stop. And just for your listeners, and you said that you're expecting most of them to be interested in Muslim community issues. Let's take one really positive thing that comes out of the Bloom report, and that is if you look at the details of the responses of who's dissatisfied with their religion, Muslims come up as the least dissatisfied. So you've got a lot of other religious communities expressing conflict within the community and so on. And amongst British Muslims, a high degree of positive expressions of what it means to be a Muslim, what it means to be a Muslim in Britain. And I think that one could say, well, Bloom was looking for positive things to say, and it's there in the detail in the fine detail on the page. There are positive things to say about how people are living their faith within Britain.
So this review follows other government reviews, most recently the Shawcross Review of Prevent, which we've briefly discussed today. John, how does the Bloom Review fit within this wider political context?
Yes, it is interesting. They're called independent reviews, but neither of them is truly independent in the sense that the person chosen is chosen for their alignment with the government's views more generally. But also what one anticipates that a review does is come up with arguments and points for discussion, which would be part of the normal deliberative processes of democracy, that they would be discussed in Parliament and outside as well, and others would have an opportunity to contribute after the review was published to make their arguments clear. But what you notice, and it's very striking in the Bloom review, he refers to the fact that, and that the language is significant, even though this review is robustly independent from its even though this review is robustly independent from its outset, it had a no surprises policy and was committed to transparency to all stakeholders, including government. That is, the government was informed about the review in the process of doing the review, and the selections and the topics that were looked at were ones that would not surprise the government. I think that, for example, is one of the reasons why in discussions of education, there is no discussion of sex and relationship education in schools, which became such a live topic within the Conservative Party over the last 6 months. But the same was also true of the Shawcross Review. The Shawcross Review came up with recommendations. Those recommendations were immediately accepted by government, by the Home Secretary. and they were of a kind that didn't require any primary legislation, so they will not be subject to debate. So you're getting quite important policy initiatives that will affect the lives of many people in Britain that are being brought in through a process of government by review and government by the management of the media. So in each case, Shawcross and Bloom, it was significant that the media was well briefed in advance about what was going to be in the reports and so on. And so favorable media reports alongside absence of discussion in Parliament and a general decline in public participation, both locally and nationally.
Thank you, John. Yahya, do you have anything you'd like to add to what John has just said?
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with what John has said. And as for the way forward, I would add that, you know, we want to return to something like deliberative democracy where, you know, citizens and civil society plays an active role in debating policy and law. In between elections, you know, it's very important. It's not that it's a once in a 5-year thing. Events happen and governments have to respond and the public has to remain alert, and reports, major reports and reviews should be one of the ways in which we do that in a thoughtful and sustained way. And if it's really just announcing a set of government initiatives that were agreed internally, then it's not really, its independence is really non-existent. And we really need to get away from this. I mean, I should say that the penalty for this approach of government by review is that communities, including the Muslim community, are becoming increasingly suspicious of them. And so there's a significant move to no longer submit to these reviews because they feel that it's already a done deal. They're not genuinely independent, and that if we submit to them, we will be lending them a legitimacy they do not deserve. And so I think in the long run, that they're going to become less and less effective.
It's been a fascinating discussion with the both of you. Thank you again so much for giving up your respective time to join us today. I know, John, we've had you on a couple of times before. We'll definitely see you again, Yahya. This is the first time we've had you on a podcast or an event with Community Policy Forum, so I'm sure we're going to continue to work together, and we'd love to welcome you back in the not too distant future. Thank you to all of our listeners. Please make sure you follow here on Twitter, his work and also the work of the Ayan Institute, and definitely keep up with the work of John Holwood, as I'm sure you would be already. And please do follow Community Policy Forum on Twitter, on Instagram, on LinkedIn. Subscribe to us on YouTube. This has been our podcast, Community Policy Speaks. Do check out our other episodes on whichever platform you're listening on today. Thank you very much, both of you, and thank you all for listening.